The proposal begins with one of the strangest foundations imaginable for a romantic comedy: deportation. Not a candlelit dinner, not a chance encounter in the rain, not two strangers discovering they were secretly meant for each other. Instead, Margaret Tate discovers that she may be forced to leave the country, looks across her office, and announces that she is engaged to the man who works for her. And somehow that ridiculous lie becomes a love story. But the interesting thing about the proposal is that it is not really a story about two people who suddenly fall in love. It is a story about two people who spend most of their lives misunderstanding what they actually need. Margaret thinks control is the answer. She has built an entire identity around it. She controls meetings, deadlines, employees, conversations, and even the emotional temperature of every room she enters. At work, she is practically a force of nature. People do not simply dislike Margaret, they fear her. Her presence can make an entire office go silent. And then there is Andrew. To Margaret, he is her assistant. He takes calls, organizes schedules, follows instructions, and absorbs the consequences of her impossible demands. From the outside, Andrew appears obedient, almost painfully so. But underneath that polite exterior is someone with ambitions of his own, someone who has spent years swallowing resentment because he believes that playing Margaret's game is the price of getting where he wants to go. So when Margaret suddenly announces that they are engaged, Andrew is given something he has never really possessed in their professional relationship: leverage. That is where the movie's central joke becomes something more interesting. Because the fake engagement should be completely unbelievable. These two people barely tolerate each other. Their relationship begins as a transaction. Margaret needs Andrew because she needs to remain in America. Andrew agrees because the situation gives him professional leverage. There is manipulation on both sides, and neither person enters the arrangement looking for romance. And yet the lie works. Why? That is the question worth asking about the proposal. How can a relationship built on deception eventually become emotionally honest? The answer begins when Margaret leaves the world where she knows exactly how to behave. Manhattan gives her power. The office gives her authority. Her expensive clothes, controlled movements, and intimidating reputation all reinforce the same message. Margaret Tate is someone who cannot be touched. Then she arrives in Alaska. Suddenly, none of those rules matter. Instead of glass offices and polished conference rooms, she finds a family home, unpredictable relatives, open wilderness, awkward traditions, and people who are completely unimpressed by her professional status. The woman who can dominate a publishing office now has to survive a world where she cannot simply issue an order and expect everyone to obey. And that contrast is the engine of the entire movie. Margaret's corporate world is controlled, efficient, and emotionally sterile. Andrew's family environment is chaotic, embarrassing, intimate, and strangely warm. One world allows Margaret to hide behind competence. The other forces her to become a person. That is why the comedy carries more emotional weight than it initially appears to. The falling, the awkward conversations, the family disasters, the ridiculous situations. These moments are funny because Margaret's carefully constructed identity keeps breaking apart. But underneath every joke is the same uncomfortable idea. What happens when the person you have spent years pretending to be is no longer enough to protect you? And Andrew has his own version of the problem. He believes obedience will get him ahead. Margaret believes control will keep her safe. Both assumptions begin collapsing at the same time. What makes the proposal endure, then, is not the originality of its premise. It is the emotional contradiction at its center. A fake relationship becomes the one place where two guarded people eventually become honest. And maybe that is why this movie still works years later. Because beneath the absurd immigration setup, the corporate insults, the family chaos, and the romantic comedy formula, The Proposal is really asking a surprisingly serious question. What if the person who forces you to lose control is the person who finally teaches you how to let someone in? Section 1.2, Video Roadmap. To understand why that question matters, we have to look beyond the obvious romance. At first glance, The Proposal seems like a familiar late 2000s romantic comedy, built around a simple formula. Take two attractive stars, put them in an impossible situation, surround them with eccentric supporting characters, add escalating misunderstandings, and eventually turn the fake relationship into a real one. But that description leaves out the part that actually makes the movie memorable. The real story is about transformation. So rather than simply walking through the plot and reminding ourselves what happens, we're going to look at why the movie's individual pieces fit together, and why some of them work much better than others. We'll start with Margaret Tate, because understanding her means understanding the entire emotional structure of the film. Why is she so controlling? Why does she treat vulnerability like a weakness? And why does the woman who seems to have everything actually appear to have almost no personal life outside her career? Then we'll turn to Andrew Paxton, whose relationship with Margaret is more complicated than the simple boss and assistant dynamic suggests. Andrew resents her, but he also wants something from her. He wants advancement, recognition, and eventually the freedom to stop being defined by her. Then comes the Paxton family, because the family is not simply there to make Margaret uncomfortable. Their presence changes the emotional environment of the story. Around them, Margaret begins experiencing something she has largely avoided, belonging without having to earn it through professional achievement. That makes Alaska more than a location. It becomes a storytelling device. The film takes Margaret from one extreme to another, from controlled Manhattan offices to an environment where nature, family, embarrassment, and unpredictability constantly interfere with her carefully managed identity. We'll look at how that contrast is built visually and dramatically, and why moving the story away from the workplace gives the romance room to breathe. We'll also break down the chemistry between Sandra Bullock and Ryan Reynolds, because without that chemistry, none of this works. The premise can be absurd. The characters can be exaggerated. The plot can be predictable. But if we believe the two people at the center of it, the audience will follow them almost anywhere. From there, we'll examine the filmmaking itself, and Fletcher's direction, the production design, cinematography, editing, physical comedy, music, and the ways the movie moves between broad humor and genuine emotion without completely losing its balance. Then we'll step outside the movie. We'll look at how audiences and critics responded, what the film says about the romantic comedy genre, why certain elements have aged differently, and how The Proposal fits into a Hollywood era when major studios were still regularly putting recognizable stars at the center of original romantic stories. And eventually we'll come back to the question we started with. Why does this fake relationship become believable? Because that answer tells us something bigger about romantic comedies themselves. Maybe the best ones were never really about finding someone who completes you. Maybe they were about finding someone who makes it impossible to keep pretending that you are already complete. Section 1.3, Audience Connection. If you watched movies during the late 2000s, there is a good chance The Proposal feels less like a film you discovered and more like a film that was simply everywhere. This was an era when Hollywood still treated the romantic comedy as a major mainstream theatrical genre. Studios could build entire releases around the chemistry of two stars and trust audiences to show up for a story about relationships, misunderstandings, career problems, family pressure, and eventually love. And Sandra Bullock was one of the clearest faces of that tradition. By the time The Proposal arrived, audiences already knew that Bullock could make romantic comedy work because she had spent years balancing warmth, sarcasm, physical humor, and emotional vulnerability. She could play someone completely ridiculous without making the character feel disposable. Reynolds was arriving from a slightly different direction. He already had the timing, confidence, and natural charisma that would eventually make him one of Hollywood's defining comedic leading men. But in The Proposal, there is something particularly interesting about seeing him before that image became fully established. Andrew is charming, but he is not simply there to be charming. He has irritation, insecurity, ambition, and enough backbone to push back against Margaret. That balance is crucial. The classic opposites attract formula only works when both opposites have something the other person secretly needs. Margaret has power but almost no emotional safety. Andrew has charm and family support but feels professionally trapped. She needs to learn how to belong. He needs to learn how to stop measuring his worth through someone else's approval. And that makes their relationship strangely relatable, even when the circumstances are completely unrealistic. There is also a fantasy at the center of the movie that many viewers understand immediately: escaping your exhausting professional identity. Margaret lives inside her job. Her apartment, wardrobe, schedule, and personality all seem connected to work. Andrew is only slightly different. He has spent so much time serving Margaret's career that his own ambitions have become tangled up in hers. Then Alaska interrupts everything. For viewers who remember the era, that shift is part of the nostalgia. It reminds us of a particular kind of studio movie that could be glossy, silly, sentimental, star-driven, and completely unapologetic about wanting to make audiences feel good. But younger viewers can discover something else in it. Because beneath the jokes is a story about workplace exhaustion, emotional isolation, ambition, and the fear that if people ever see who you really are, they might not like what they find. That fear has not aged. In fact, it may be even more recognizable now. We live in a world where people constantly perform versions of themselves: professional versions, social versions, successful versions, confident versions. Margaret simply takes that idea to an extreme. And that may be why so many people remember the jokes from The Proposal, while forgetting how carefully the movie builds its emotional architecture. We remember the chaos. We remember the family. We remember the chemistry. But underneath all of it is a surprisingly simple idea. Sometimes the person who sees through your performance is the person you least expect to trust. And to understand how the movie turns that idea into a commercial romantic comedy, we have to go back to where the whole thing began. Part 2, Context Background. Section 2.1, Production Origins. The Proposal arrived at a moment when the romantic comedy was still a dependable part of the Hollywood studio system. The genre did not necessarily need an elaborate mythology or a massive action spectacle. It needed a recognizable emotional problem, appealing stars, and enough personality to make a familiar formula feel fresh. The fake engagement premise provided exactly that. On paper, it is almost aggressively simple. A powerful woman facing deportation claims that her assistant is her fiancé. He agrees to the lie, but only after negotiating better treatment for himself. Then circumstances force them to spend time together, and eventually the fake relationship becomes real. The structure is high concept because you understand the joke almost immediately. But the simplicity of the premise also creates its biggest creative challenge. If the audience does not believe Margaret and Andrew could eventually care about each other, the entire movie collapses. That is where casting becomes everything. Sandra Bullock was already deeply associated with romantic comedy, but Margaret needed to be different from the traditionally lovable heroine. She could not enter the movie as secretly sweet underneath everything. She needed to be genuinely difficult. Her cruelty had to feel believable enough that Andrew's resentment made sense. That decision gives the romance somewhere to go. If Margaret begins at 80% likability and becomes slightly nicer, there is no transformation. But if she begins emotionally armored, controlling, and intimidating, then every small moment of vulnerability carries more weight. Reynolds provides the necessary counterbalance. Andrew cannot simply be a victim of Margaret's behavior. If he were, the relationship would feel uncomfortable rather than entertaining. He needs ambition. He needs intelligence. He needs the confidence to recognize the moment when the power dynamic changes. That is why his response to Margaret's fake engagement is so important. For perhaps the first time, the assistant has something the boss desperately needs. And Andrew knows it. That reversal creates the comedy, but it also establishes the foundation of their relationship. Margaret is accustomed to controlling people through authority. Andrew is accustomed to obeying because he wants something from her. When the immigration problem appears, both characters suddenly have to renegotiate the rules. And Fletcher's direction becomes especially important because the movie needs to move between exaggerated comedy and emotional sincerity without making either side feel like a completely different film. Fletcher understood that the premise would only survive if the characters remained recognizable underneath the absurdity. That is why the Alaska portion matters so much. Manhattan gives Margaret an environment where she is the authority. Alaska takes that authority away. The change is not simply geographic. It is psychological. The Paxton family creates a completely different set of rules. They interrupt Margaret. They question her. They embarrass her. They involve her in activities she cannot control. Most importantly, they begin treating her as a person before she has done anything to deserve their affection. That becomes especially significant through Grandma Annie, played by Betty White. White's presence adds another layer to the movie because she possesses an entirely different kind of power from Margaret. Margaret dominates through intimidation. Annie dominates through personality. She can walk into a scene and completely change its rhythm. The supporting cast therefore becomes part of the film's emotional machinery. The Paxtons are not merely obstacles standing between Margaret and Andrew. They are the first environment where Margaret experiences a version of family life that is messy, intrusive, affectionate, and surprisingly accepting. That contrast also creates a practical comedic strategy. The movie repeatedly places controlled characters inside uncontrolled environments. Margaret controls an office, so put her on a boat. Margaret controls conversations, so surround her with people who interrupt. Margaret controls her appearance, so place her in situations where physical embarrassment is unavoidable. Margaret controls emotional distance, so put her in a family that constantly demands emotional proximity. The comedy comes from watching a person who has mastered one environment suddenly become helpless in another. And underneath that is the production's central challenge. How do you make an intentionally ridiculous story feel emotionally grounded? The answer was never going to be realism. It was contrast. Margaret versus Andrew. Manhattan versus Alaska. Career versus family. Control versus chaos. Performance versus authenticity. And eventually fake love versus real love. Section 2.2. Pre-release landscape. When the proposal entered the 2009 marketplace, the romantic comedy was operating under a familiar set of expectations. Audiences knew the formula. They knew that two people who hated each other would probably fall in love. They knew there would be misunderstandings. They knew supporting characters would interfere. They knew the final act would probably involve some kind of emotional separation followed by a grand romantic gesture. So the challenge was not inventing an entirely new genre. It was making the familiar feel irresistible. And Hollywood had a powerful advantage when it came to romantic comedy. Stars. A recognizable actor could make a conventional story feel like an event. The audience did not necessarily need to believe the premise literally. They needed to believe that the people on screen were worth spending 2 hours with. Sandra Bullock had enormous value in that equation. She could carry comedy without sacrificing emotional credibility, and she had already established herself as a performer who could make flawed characters accessible. Putting her at the center of a romantic comedy meant the audience immediately understood what kind of experience they were being offered. Ryan Reynolds added another ingredient. His charisma gave the movie a contemporary energy, and his ability to switch between sarcasm, confidence, irritation, and vulnerability made Andrew more than a generic romantic lead. The marketing could therefore sell the film almost entirely through the premise. Boss says they're engaged. Assistant says they're getting married. Neither one actually loves the other. Then they have to convince everyone else. That is instantly understandable. The trailers could emphasize awkwardness, family chaos, physical comedy, and the contrast between Margaret's terrifying professional persona and the ridiculous situation she encounters in Alaska. And that contrast was one of the film's strongest selling points. Manhattan represented the world audiences already associated with Margaret. Offices, expensive clothing, deadlines, authority, and pressure. Alaska represented the opposite. Family, nature, tradition, unpredictability, and a lifestyle Margaret clearly does not understand. Even the idea of putting these two worlds together creates anticipation. What happens when a woman who can intimidate an entire publishing company suddenly has to convince a family she has never met that she is their son's fiancée? That is the kind of question a trailer can answer in seconds. Betty White's presence only strengthened the appeal. Her comedic timing and recognizable persona gave the film another promotional hook, particularly because she could generate laughs without needing the story to explain why she was funny. But beneath the marketing was a more traditional commercial proposition. The proposal was selling chemistry. That was the real product. The fake engagement got people interested, but the relationship between Bullock and Reynolds had to keep them invested. This distinction would become important later, because the movie's long-term life would not depend entirely on whether audiences remembered the immigration mechanics or the exact sequence of events. They would remember Margaret. They would remember Andrew. They would remember the family. They would remember the moments when the two leads stopped looking like people trapped inside a joke and started looking like two people who genuinely understood each other. And that is the gap between a movie that performs well and a movie that becomes a comfort film. In 2009, the commercial expectation was simple. Deliver a funny romantic comedy with two major stars. What happened afterward was more interesting. The movie became part of the nostalgia surrounding an entire era of Hollywood filmmaking. An era when a theatrical romantic comedy could be built around personalities rather than superheroes, franchises, or elaborate intellectual property. To understand why that worked, though, we have to actually enter Margaret Tate's world. And the first thing that world tells us is that Margaret does not look like someone who needs saving. Part 3 Story Recap. Section 3.1. Act 1 Setup. Margaret Tate's introduction tells us almost everything we need to know about her, without requiring a speech explaining her personality. She is powerful. She is feared. And she knows exactly how to use both facts. Inside the publishing company, Margaret has developed a reputation that makes people nervous before she even enters a room. Employees anticipate her demands. Assistants anticipate her criticism. Meetings seem to bend around her schedule, because everyone has learned that Margaret expects the world to accommodate her, rather than the other way around. And Andrew Paxton is one of the people paying the price. As her assistant, Andrew handles the endless practical details that allow Margaret to maintain her perfectly controlled professional existence. He schedules things. He carries things. He remembers things. He absorbs her frustration. But there is an obvious problem. Andrew does not want to remain her assistant forever. He has ambitions of his own, and he has written a book. He wants to become an editor. He wants a career rather than a position. But Margaret has repeatedly kept him in the role that serves her best. So when the movie begins, their relationship is already built on an imbalance. Margaret has authority. Andrew has resentment. Then Margaret's entire world changes in a single moment. She learns that her immigration status has become a serious problem. Because she is Canadian and has been living and working in the United States, she faces the possibility of being deported. For someone like Margaret, the threat is almost existential. Her career is in America. Her carefully constructed life is in America. Her independence is in America. And suddenly all of it can disappear. The woman who normally controls every situation now has absolutely no control over the one situation that matters most. Then she sees Andrew, and makes a decision that is as reckless as it is brilliant. She tells the immigration authorities that she and Andrew are engaged. Andrew's reaction is exactly what you would expect from someone who has just discovered that his boss has invented their marriage. He is stunned. But the more interesting part comes afterward. Because Andrew realizes something Margaret does not initially appreciate. The power has shifted. Margaret needs him. For years, Andrew has been the employee who has to accept her demands. Now she is the one who needs something from him. So instead of simply agreeing, Andrew negotiates. He wants a promotion. He wants his career taken seriously. And he wants Margaret to stop treating him like an extension of her schedule. For the first time, Margaret cannot simply command. She has to bargain. The fake engagement becomes an agreement between two people who each believe they are getting what they want. Margaret gets to stay in America. Andrew gets leverage over his boss. Neither understands the emotional consequences yet. The immigration authorities are skeptical, and that skepticism creates another problem. If Margaret and Andrew are really engaged, they need to behave like people who are actually in love. That means knowing personal details. That means meeting family. That means explaining how they supposedly fell in love. And that means Andrew has to take Margaret home. Not to a luxury hotel. Not to another Manhattan office. To Alaska. For Margaret, this is essentially a sentence. She is leaving the one environment where she understands the rules, and entering one where she understands almost nothing. The fake relationship has officially become more complicated than either person expected. And for Andrew, there is another opportunity hidden inside it. If Margaret wants him to convince his family, then the woman who has controlled his professional life may soon have to play by his rules. The assistant is finally holding the leash. But neither of them realizes that Alaska is about to take away both of their defenses. Section 3.2. Act 1 Continued Call to Adventure. The arrival in Alaska feels almost like the movie has been transported into another genre. Margaret comes from a world of polished offices, expensive clothing, professional hierarchy, and carefully managed appearances. Andrew's family world is warmer, louder, messier, and far less interested in maintaining the illusion of control. The Paxtons immediately complicate the lie. Andrew's parents have their own expectations, their own history with him, and their own understanding of what his life is supposed to look like. Margaret cannot simply walk into the house and announce that she is Andrew's fiancée without consequences. Everyone wants details. How did they meet? How long have they been together? Why did Andrew never mention her? Why is everything happening so quickly? The questions are reasonable, but to Margaret they are dangerous because she has built an entire relationship out of improvisation. And Andrew knows it. He begins correcting her. He fills in details she gets wrong. He reminds her of supposed memories. He deliberately places her in situations where she has to prove that she knows him. There is something almost satisfying about watching the power dynamic reverse. Margaret, who normally controls every conversation, is suddenly taking instructions from Andrew. And Andrew enjoys it. Not necessarily because he is cruel, but because it is probably the first time he has felt that Margaret cannot simply dismiss him. That creates the movie's early comedic energy. Margaret is competent at almost everything she does professionally, but she is terrible at pretending to be part of a family. She does not understand the rhythms of the household. She does not understand why people behave the way they do. She is uncomfortable with casual affection. She is constantly trying to calculate what everyone expects from her. And the family sees through that discomfort. The presence of Andrew's former girlfriend makes everything even more complicated. She represents a version of Andrew's life that existed before Margaret entered it. Her presence also creates a subtle threat to Margaret's performance, because she knows Andrew in a way Margaret does not. This is where the movie begins using embarrassment as a romantic tool. Margaret is constantly placed in situations where she cannot maintain dignity. The more embarrassed she becomes, the less control she has. And strangely enough, the less control she has, the more human she becomes. Andrew notices. At first, he sees an opportunity to tease her. Then he begins noticing details that do not fit the image he has created of her. Margaret is still demanding. She is still difficult. She is still capable of being selfish. But she is also clearly uncomfortable. She is clearly isolated. And she seems genuinely unsure of how to exist in an environment where people are not impressed by her title. That begins changing Andrew's perception. He does not suddenly forgive everything she has done, but he starts seeing Margaret as a person instead of simply as the boss he hates. And Margaret begins seeing something different in Andrew too. He is not merely the obedient assistant she has relied on. He has ambition. He has confidence. He understands his family. He knows how to manipulate the situation when necessary. And most importantly, he is willing to challenge her. Their hostility begins developing another layer. The arguments are still funny. The situations are still ridiculous. But now there is chemistry underneath them. The fake relationship is becoming harder to perform precisely because the performances are beginning to contain real emotion. They have crossed the threshold. The question is no longer whether they can convince everyone else that they are a couple. The question is whether they are beginning to convince themselves. Section 3.3. Act 2 A Rising Action. Once Margaret settles into Alaska, the movie begins changing its emotional rhythm. The first stage was about survival. Now it becomes about exposure. Margaret is no longer simply trying to convince the Paxtons that she belongs there. She is gradually becoming involved in their lives. That difference matters. At first, every family interaction is a performance. Margaret is playing the role of Andrew's loving fiancée because she has no choice. But the longer she stays, the more difficult it becomes to separate the performance from genuine behavior. Andrew's mother, Grace, creates one of the first cracks in Margaret's defenses. Grace does not treat her like a powerful executive. She does not care about her reputation. She interacts with Margaret as though she is simply another person entering the family. That can be more disarming than hostility. Margaret knows how to respond to judgment. She does not know how to respond to uncomplicated warmth. Then there is Grandma Annie. Annie's humor makes Margaret uncomfortable, but it also creates moments where Margaret is pulled into the family's rhythm. The jokes, teasing, and absurd situations repeatedly force her to stop thinking about how she appears and simply react. That is a major part of her transformation. Margaret's problem has never been that she does not know how to behave. Her problem is that she is always behaving for a reason. Every action has a purpose. Every conversation has a strategy. Every relationship seems to contain an exchange. Alaska introduces something different. People do things simply because they care. And Andrew begins noticing how unfamiliar that is to her. Their forced proximity also changes their dynamic. They spend more time together than they ever did in the office. But now there is no desk between them and no professional hierarchy to hide behind. Andrew still resents her. He still teases her. He still remembers the way she has held him back. But revenge gradually becomes less satisfying. Because the more he learns about Margaret, the harder it becomes to maintain the simple story that she is just a terrible person. She has flaws, but those flaws are connected to fear. Her need for control is connected to vulnerability. Her isolation is connected to self-protection. And Andrew begins understanding that the person who appears strongest in the room may actually be the person most afraid of losing everything. At the same time, Margaret begins learning about Andrew's ambitions. She sees that he wants more than an assistant's job. She begins understanding that he has been performing obedience because he believes it will eventually lead somewhere. That creates an interesting mirror between them. Margaret controls because she is afraid of losing power. Andrew obeys because he is afraid that challenging power will cost him his future. Both are trapped by their relationship to authority. Both have built identities around survival. And now they are being forced into a situation where those identities no longer function properly. The comedy becomes more physical during this stretch because physical embarrassment is one of the easiest ways to destroy Margaret's sense of control. She cannot remain perfectly composed when everything around her is unpredictable. And every time she loses composure, Andrew sees more of the person underneath. The audience does too. The fake engagement starts becoming convincing not because Margaret and Andrew become better actors, but because they begin behaving naturally around each other. They know each other's rhythms. They anticipate reactions. They tease each other. They protect each other in small moments. And that is the dangerous part. The immigration investigation is still approaching. The lie still has consequences. But now there is something else at stake. They are no longer simply afraid of being caught. They may be afraid of discovering that the relationship was never entirely fake. Section 3.4. Act 2B Midpoint Crisis. The emotional midpoint of the proposal arrives when Margaret begins experiencing something she did not expect to find in Alaska. Acceptance. She came to Andrew's family because she needed them to believe a lie. Instead, she starts discovering what it feels like to be welcomed into a family. That distinction is everything. Margaret has spent years building a life around independence. She does not ask for help. She does not seem to need anyone. Her professional reputation depends on appearing completely self-sufficient. But the Paxtons do not seem particularly interested in that image. They invite her into their world. They joke with her. They embarrass her. They include her. And Grandma Annie becomes especially important because she represents the kind of affection Margaret cannot control or purchase. Margaret's relationship with Annie gradually reveals the loneliness underneath her confidence. There are moments when Margaret's carefully constructed identity slips. The woman who seemed almost incapable of vulnerability suddenly looks like someone who has spent a long time without feeling genuinely included. Andrew notices, and that changes the emotional equation. For most of the movie, Andrew has had every reason to resent Margaret. She is his boss. She has treated him badly. She has interfered with his career. But now he is seeing the person underneath the behavior. The problem is that understanding someone does not erase what they have done. And that tension keeps the romance from becoming too easy. The engagement is also becoming increasingly believable to the people around them. But there is a difference between acting like a couple and behaving like one. Actors remember their lines. People in relationships remember each other's habits. Margaret and Andrew are beginning to develop habits. They know when the other person is uncomfortable. They know when to tease and when to stop. They begin defending each other. They begin looking at each other differently. The performance is slowly becoming a language they genuinely understand. And this is where the film's central irony becomes impossible to ignore. The fake relationship is creating real honesty. Because Margaret is pretending to be Andrew's fiancée, she is forced to spend time with people who see sides of her that her professional colleagues never see. Because Andrew is pretending to be Margaret's partner, he is forced to confront the fact that his boss has an emotional life he never bothered to understand. Their deception creates intimacy precisely because it places them in circumstances where their normal defenses are useless. Margaret's history begins to matter. The details of her life outside work become more emotionally significant because they explain why she became the person she is. She is not simply a control freak because the screenplay needs her to be funny. Control is her armor. And the more comfortable she becomes with the Paxtons, the less useful that armor becomes. For Andrew, the conflict becomes different. He still wants his career. He still wants recognition. But now he has to confront the possibility that getting what he wanted from Margaret may not be as important as what he is beginning to feel for her. The pressure surrounding the engagement increases. The possibility of a wedding makes the lie feel dangerously permanent. And suddenly the question changes. Can they continue pretending? More importantly, what happens if they stop? At this point, the proposal moves beyond the basic mechanics of a fake engagement comedy. The story is now about consequences. The joke has become a relationship. And once a relationship becomes real, the truth is no longer funny. Section 3.5. Act 3 Climax Resolution. Eventually, the lie reaches the point where it cannot survive. The immigration investigation closes in, and the carefully constructed story Margaret and Andrew have built begins collapsing under scrutiny. The problem is no longer whether they can improvise another convincing answer. The problem is that their relationship has accumulated real emotional consequences. Margaret recognizes the damage that the deception has caused. The Paxton family is emotionally involved. Andrew is emotionally involved. And Margaret herself has become attached to a life she never intended to enter. The woman who arrived in Alaska thinking only about protecting her career now has something else to lose. Belonging. That is why her decision to leave carries more weight than simply escaping an immigration problem. She is returning to the world she understands, the world where she has control, the world where nobody expects emotional honesty from her. And yet, that world now feels different. Andrew is forced to confront the truth he has been avoiding. First, the engagement was useful. Then it became entertaining. Then it became complicated. And finally it became real. He loves Margaret, but realizing that is not enough. Andrew has to act. He has to choose whether the relationship is worth risking the security and professional ambitions that originally motivated him to participate. That choice completes his transformation. At the beginning, Andrew believes obedience will advance his career. By the end, he understands that ambition without agency is another form of imprisonment. He cannot simply wait for Margaret to decide his future. He has to decide for himself. That is why the final pursuit matters. Andrew does not simply chase Margaret because the genre requires a romantic gesture. He chases her because he finally understands what he wants. And when he proposes for real, the moment carries a different emotional meaning from the original fake engagement. The first proposal was a strategy. This one is a choice. The first relationship was built around fear. The second is built around honesty. Margaret's acceptance therefore represents more than agreeing to marry Andrew. She is accepting a life she cannot completely control. She is choosing connection over isolation. She is choosing vulnerability over professional armor. And Andrew is choosing Margaret not because she can help his career, but because he has discovered that the person he thought he hated has become the person he cannot imagine losing. The immigration situation is resolved, the deception is exposed, and the story closes with the kind of neat romantic comedy resolution that reality rarely provides. But that does not necessarily make the ending ineffective, because the movie has spent its entire runtime preparing us for one fundamental change. Margaret no longer needs to control every outcome. Andrew no longer needs to earn permission to become himself. And their relationship no longer needs to be justified by a crisis. The final comedic moments work because the movie can return to its absurdity after allowing the emotional conflict to breathe. The premise remains ridiculous, but the characters have changed. And that is the difference between a joke that lasts 2 hours and a romantic comedy people continue returning to years later. Part 4. Character Analysis. Section 4.1. Protagonist Deep Dive. Margaret Tate. Margaret Tate is easy to misunderstand because the movie deliberately introduces her as someone who appears almost impossible to like. She is demanding. She is intimidating. She is controlling. She uses professional authority as if it were a weapon. And she has little patience for anyone who slows her down. But the genius of the character is that these traits are not simply personality defects. They are defenses. Margaret has built a life where control protects her from uncertainty. If she controls the schedule, she cannot be surprised. If she controls the workplace, she cannot be embarrassed. If she controls the people around her, she does not have to depend on them. And if she never allows herself to become emotionally vulnerable, then nobody gets the opportunity to hurt her. The problem is that this strategy works professionally while destroying intimacy. Margaret is extremely competent. That matters. The movie does not portray her as a successful woman who accidentally stumbled into power. She is genuinely good at her job. She understands publishing. She makes decisions quickly. She has instincts. She knows what she wants. But competence can become a trap when it becomes the only acceptable form of identity. Margaret has turned herself into someone who does not need anyone. That is why the immigration crisis affects her so dramatically. It is not just a legal problem. It is a direct attack on the illusion of control she has built her life around. Suddenly, a government decision can determine where she lives. A bureaucracy can decide what happens to her career. And the person who can help her is the assistant she has spent years dominating. The irony is brutal. Margaret's professional power has never been more impressive, yet it has never been less useful. Alaska accelerates that collapse. The environment removes the symbols that normally reinforce her authority. Her office is gone. Her employees are gone. Her schedule is no longer sacred. Her clothing becomes less practical. Her surroundings are unfamiliar. And the people around her have no reason to fear her. That forces Margaret into a psychological confrontation with Andrew. He knows her professional persona better than almost anyone, but he is also one of the first people to see the private person underneath it. At first, Margaret treats that exposure as a threat. Eventually, she begins to recognize it as freedom. That is the heart of her transformation. She does not become a completely different person. She remains sharp. She remains confident. She remains ambitious. What changes is her relationship with those qualities. She no longer needs power to prove that she deserves to exist. She learns that affection cannot be managed like a business transaction, and belonging cannot be purchased through professional success. The film does not always earn every step of that transformation perfectly. Some of Margaret's emotional changes happen quickly because the genre demands momentum. But Sandra Bullock makes the process convincing because she understands how to play Margaret's vulnerability without turning her immediately into a soft, sentimental character. That is important. Bullock does not ask us to forget that Margaret can be awful. She asks us to understand why she became that way. And there is a difference. By the end, Margaret's greatest victory is not staying in America or getting married. It is allowing herself to be known. For someone who built her entire life around control, that may be the most frightening thing she could possibly do. Section 4.2. Antagonist Psychology. One of the most interesting things about the proposal is that it does not really have a traditional villain. There is no evil mastermind trying to destroy Margaret and Andrew's relationship. Instead, the movie creates a collection of opposing forces. Margaret's personality is one. The workplace hierarchy is another. The immigration system creates the external pressure. Andrew's resentment creates emotional conflict. And the expectations of the Paxton family create social pressure. Together, these forces replace the conventional romantic comedy antagonist. Margaret herself may actually be the biggest obstacle. She believes control is safety. That belief prevents her from forming genuine relationships. Even when people care about her, she instinctively turns the interaction into something she can manage. The immigration threat exposes the limits of that strategy. For the first time, Margaret cannot solve the problem simply by being powerful. Then there is Andrew. Andrew is not a villain, but he temporarily becomes an antagonist because he understands Margaret's vulnerability and uses it. That ethical complication is important. He knows she needs him. He knows she is desperate. And he uses that desperation to negotiate better treatment. At one level, it is satisfying. The assistant finally gets leverage over the boss. At another level, it reveals that Andrew is not morally superior to Margaret. He also knows how to use power when he gets it. The difference is that he has less experience with it. That makes their relationship a mirror. Both characters use emotional armor. Margaret uses authority. Andrew uses sarcasm and strategic obedience. Both are ambitious. Both are afraid of losing control. Both initially believe that emotional vulnerability is dangerous. And both eventually discover that their defenses are also keeping them isolated. This is why the changing power dynamic between them is so important. At the beginning, Margaret controls Andrew. After the fake engagement, Andrew gains leverage. As they become emotionally closer, that power becomes less relevant. The healthiest stage of their relationship arrives when neither person needs to dominate the other. The Paxton family also functions as a kind of pressure system. They are not trying to defeat Margaret, but they constantly force her into situations where her usual strategies fail. They ask personal questions. They expect participation. They notice emotional inconsistencies. They create a social environment where Margaret cannot simply remain an executive. And that pressure is ultimately constructive. The film therefore creates conflict without requiring someone to be evil. The antagonism comes from incompatible ways of living. Margaret wants control. Andrew wants recognition. The family wants authenticity. The immigration authorities want truth. The workplace wants productivity. And the romance demands vulnerability. Those forces collide until the characters have to change. That is why the movie can remain lighthearted while still creating meaningful emotional stakes. Nobody needs to be defeated. The characters simply need to stop defending themselves from the very thing they secretly want. Section 4.3. Supporting cast dynamics. The Paxton family could have been nothing more than a collection of eccentric characters designed to embarrass Margaret. Instead, they become one of the movie's most important emotional tools. Andrew's mother Grace and father Joe create the feeling of a family that has history. They know Andrew. They have expectations for him. They remember his past. And they are not easily fooled by the sudden appearance of his mysterious fiancée. That gives the fake relationship social weight. Margaret is not performing for strangers. She is performing for people who genuinely care about Andrew. That makes every mistake more uncomfortable. It also makes her eventual acceptance more meaningful. The family environment is fundamentally different from Margaret's professional world. At the publishing company, people interact according to hierarchy. At the Paxton home, people interact according to familiarity. The rules are less formal but more emotionally demanding. You can hide behind a title in an office. You cannot hide as easily at a family dinner. And then there is Grandma Annie. Betty White's performance gives the film a completely different comedic rhythm. Annie does not behave like someone who is waiting for the movie's main characters to finish talking. She creates her own energy. Her humor is unpredictable. And her presence constantly threatens Margaret's ability to remain composed. But Annie also represents something deeper. She is comfortable with herself. She does not seem interested in impressing anyone. She has the confidence to say exactly what she thinks. That makes her a strange counterpart to Margaret. Margaret has authority but lacks emotional freedom. Annie has no need for authority and therefore appears completely free. Their interactions become funny because Margaret cannot figure out how to control someone who does not care about the usual social rules. Andrew's former girlfriend adds another layer. She represents the life Andrew had before Margaret. Her presence reminds both characters that Andrew already has relationships, history, and emotional connections outside their fake engagement. That prevents the romance from existing inside a vacuum. Supporting characters are often treated as decoration in romantic comedies, but here they create pressure. They force Margaret and Andrew to perform. Then they accidentally make the performance more intimate. Every family activity puts the two leads closer together. Every embarrassing situation removes another layer of professionalism. Every joke creates an opportunity for genuine interaction. That is why ensemble chemistry matters so much. If the Paxton family did not feel alive, Alaska would simply be a strange location. Instead, it becomes a functioning emotional ecosystem. And the family also keeps the movie from becoming too focused on the two leads. Romantic comedy can become repetitive when every scene consists of the same couple arguing, flirting, and eventually kissing. The supporting cast interrupts that rhythm. They create unpredictability. They generate embarrassment. They provide alternate perspectives. And most importantly, they give Margaret something she has not had in a long time: a chance to belong to something larger than her job. The comedy therefore serves a larger emotional function. Awkwardness becomes intimacy, embarrassment becomes exposure, and family becomes the environment where the woman who spent her life controlling appearances finally begins allowing people to see her. Part 5 Theme Symbolism. Section 5.1 Core Themes. At the center of the proposal is a contradiction. Love emerges from deception. That sounds like a problem for a romantic story, but it is actually what gives the movie its emotional structure. Margaret and Andrew begin by performing identities. She performs control. He performs obedience. Together, they perform a relationship. But the strange result is that the fake relationship creates circumstances in which they become more honest than they have ever been. That is why control versus vulnerability becomes the film's most important thematic conflict. Margaret believes control protects her. Andrew believes professional obedience protects his future. Both characters are trying to secure themselves against uncertainty. But relationships do not work that way. You cannot completely control another person's feelings. You cannot guarantee that someone will stay. You cannot negotiate affection like a promotion. And eventually both characters have to accept that. The movie also contrasts career success with emotional fulfillment. Margaret has achieved professional power, but that power has come at a cost. She is isolated. Andrew is younger and still climbing, but he is already beginning to define himself through career approval. Both characters are ambitious, yet neither seems fully satisfied. That makes the romance function as more than a love story. It becomes a challenge to the idea that professional success automatically produces personal happiness. Then there is belonging. Margaret's arrival in Alaska places her inside a family that does not care about her title. They care about whether she is present. That is profoundly threatening to someone who has spent years measuring her value through achievement. The fantasy at the heart of the movie is not simply finding a romantic partner. It is being accepted without having to prove that you deserve acceptance. That is why identity becomes so important. Margaret has created a workplace persona so powerful that it has almost replaced her private self. Andrew has created an obedient employee persona that hides his ambition. The fake relationship forces both personas into situations where they stop working. And that is where connection becomes possible. The appeal is universal because most people understand the tension between the person they present and the person they are. We behave differently at work than we do with family. We perform confidence when we are uncertain. We hide fear behind sarcasm. We sometimes use ambition to avoid asking whether we are actually happy. The proposal packages those uncomfortable ideas inside an extremely accessible romantic comedy. That is part of its secret. It can talk about emotional isolation without sounding like a drama. It can talk about vulnerability while making the audience laugh. And it can suggest that the person who knows your worst habits may eventually become the person who understands you best. Section 5.2 Visual Symbolism. The film's visual language reinforces the psychological difference between Margaret's two worlds. Manhattan is controlled. Its offices, elevators, glass surfaces, polished interiors, and professional clothing create a visual environment where everything appears organized. Margaret belongs there. She moves through those spaces with confidence because the environment reflects the identity she has constructed. The office is almost an extension of her personality. It is efficient. It is intimidating. It is emotionally distant. And Margaret appears strongest when surrounded by those visual boundaries. Then Alaska opens everything up. The landscapes are larger. The spaces are less controlled. Nature creates visual freedom that Margaret does not initially know how to handle. That difference becomes psychological storytelling. In Manhattan, Margaret is protected by structures. In Alaska, those structures disappear. The environment exposes her. Even costume participates in that transformation. Margaret's professional wardrobe communicates status and control. Her clothing is part of the armor she wears every day. Around the Paxton family, those clothes become increasingly impractical. She has to adapt. She has to participate. And the more she visually moves away from the corporate identity, the more the audience can see the person underneath it. The Paxton home creates another important contrast. It is domestic rather than corporate, warm rather than polished, lived in rather than controlled. It contains memories and family history. Margaret enters that environment as an outsider, but gradually becomes part of it. Wedding imagery also carries an obvious but useful symbolic contradiction. The wedding is supposed to represent genuine commitment, yet Margaret and Andrew's relationship begins as a legal performance. The closer they get to the possibility of marriage, the more the difference between performance and reality becomes complicated. Physical proximity works in the same way. At the beginning, Margaret and Andrew exist within a professional hierarchy. Even when they are physically close, the relationship feels distant. In Alaska, circumstances repeatedly force them into proximity. They share space. They interact socially. They see each other outside work. And eventually, physical closeness begins reflecting emotional closeness. The visual progression, therefore, follows the psychological journey. Closed spaces become open spaces. Professional clothing becomes more casual. Isolation becomes family interaction. Distance becomes proximity. And control gradually gives way to connection. The movie does not need to announce these ideas because the environments communicate them. Margaret's journey is literally a movement from a world she can control into a world she cannot. And that is precisely where she begins to change. Section 5.3. Deeper meanings. Perhaps the most interesting way to understand the proposal is to stop thinking about the fake engagement as an unusual plot device and start thinking about it as a metaphor. Everyone in the movie is performing a role. Margaret performs invulnerability. Andrew performs obedience. The Paxton family performs a version of normalcy. And the fake couple performs romance. The irony is that the fake performance creates the conditions for real honesty. Margaret cannot tell the truth about her relationship, but she is forced to reveal parts of herself she normally hides. Andrew cannot admit exactly how he feels about Margaret, but spending time with her forces him to reconsider the story he has told himself about her. The relationship therefore becomes a strange emotional laboratory. Take away their normal identities, put them in a new environment, force them to rely on each other, then watch what happens. What emerges is the idea that social status and emotional worth are not the same thing. Margaret's professional title gives her power, but it does not give her belonging. Andrew's career ambitions give him direction, but they do not guarantee fulfillment. The family provides another model. Here, people are valued because they are family. That sounds simple, but for Margaret it is revolutionary. She has spent so much of her life proving her worth that unconditional acceptance becomes almost incomprehensible. This is also why the film's fantasy of reinvention works. Margaret enters Alaska as Margaret Tate, the terrifying executive. But the environment gives her an opportunity to become someone else. Not because she becomes fake, but because she stops performing the version of herself that she thinks everyone expects. Romantic comedy is particularly well suited to this kind of idea. The genre is exaggerated enough to make vulnerability feel safe. Audiences can laugh at the awkwardness while still recognizing themselves in the emotional problem. And that may explain the movie's rewatchability. The first time we watch to find out whether Margaret and Andrew will get together. The second time we may notice why they need each other. The jokes remain funny, but the emotional architecture becomes clearer. Everyone wants to be accepted after the performance ends. Everyone fears that the authentic version of themselves might be less lovable than the polished version. The proposal turns that fear into a fantasy where the opposite happens. The more Margaret reveals, the more Andrew understands her. The less Andrew performs obedience, the more Margaret respects him. The fake relationship becomes real because the people inside it gradually stop acting. And whether the movie consciously designed every one of these layers is almost beside the point. Great popular films often communicate more than their creators explicitly announce. Sometimes a ridiculous romantic comedy survives because underneath its formula is one honest idea. You do not find belonging by becoming more impressive. You find it by becoming more real. Part 6 Production Breakdown. Section 6.1 Animation Visual Effects. Because the proposal is live action, its visual storytelling does not depend on animation in the traditional sense. Its real visual effects come from cinematography, production design, locations, editing, costume, and the physical relationship between the actors and their environments. The movie understands that romantic comedy does not require spectacular imagery. It requires readable imagery. The audience needs to understand where the characters are, how they relate to one another, and what emotional space they occupy. That is why the Manhattan sequences feel polished and controlled. Margaret's office reflects her professional identity. The spaces are clean and organized, and the framing often reinforces hierarchy. Margaret appears like someone who belongs at the center. Andrew often appears like someone operating around her. That visual arrangement reinforces the workplace power structure before the dialogue even explains it. Alaska changes the visual grammar. The environment becomes more expansive. The characters are placed against landscapes that are much larger than their professional world. That scale has an emotional effect. Margaret's authority suddenly looks small. The Paxton home provides the opposite kind of visual warmth. Feels lived in. It contains family history. It is not designed to impress Margaret. It is designed to contain the people who live there. That distinction matters because production design becomes part of character development. Costume works similarly. Margaret's clothing communicates professional control, while Andrew's appearance becomes more relaxed in his family environment. The visual difference helps separate their public and private identities. Then there is the framing of Bullock and Reynolds together. Romantic comedy often depends on how long two actors are allowed to share a frame. If editing constantly separates them, chemistry becomes harder to perceive. When the movie allows them to occupy the same space, the audience can watch reactions develop naturally. A look can become a joke. A pause can become tension. A reaction can communicate attraction before either character admits it. This is especially important during physical comedy. The film does not need elaborate effects to make awkward situations funny. It needs timing. A character moves unexpectedly. Another character reacts. The audience anticipates the embarrassment. Then the editing delivers the payoff. That rhythm keeps the comedy connected to character. The scenery also becomes emotional punctuation. Alaska's landscapes create moments of scale and quiet that interrupt the constant comedy. Those pauses matter because without them, the romance would feel mechanical. The movie needs moments when Margaret and Andrew can simply exist together. That balance between spectacle and intimacy is one of the production's strongest visual achievements. The film looks polished enough to feel like a studio romantic comedy, but it does not allow the scenery to become more important than the people. Everything eventually returns to Margaret and Andrew. The environment changes them. The camera observes them. The editing controls their rhythm. And the visual language keeps reminding us that their relationship is moving from one world into another. Section 6.2 Directorial Vision. And Fletcher's biggest challenge was not making the audience laugh. It was making the audience believe. The premise is so exaggerated that the direction could easily have pushed the film into pure slapstick. Instead, Fletcher generally allows the actors to carry the humor. That decision is important because character-driven comedy tends to age better than jokes that exist only to announce themselves. Margaret is funny because she is Margaret. Andrew is funny because he knows exactly how absurd Margaret is. The family is funny because their reactions expose how strange the situation has become. Fletcher's use of reaction is therefore crucial. A joke often becomes funnier when the camera allows another character to process what just happened. Bullock and Reynolds understand this instinctively. Their chemistry is built on timing. One character says something. The other waits. A look communicates irritation. Then the response arrives. That rhythm creates the feeling that these two people actually know each other. The direction also uses contrast consistently. Manhattan is controlled. Alaska is chaotic. The workplace is structured. The family environment is unpredictable. Margaret is guarded. Andrew is more relaxed socially. These contrasts create comedy because the characters are constantly placed outside their comfort zones. Fletcher also understands that physical comedy works best when the audience understands the character's emotional relationship to the situation. Margaret's embarrassment is funny because dignity is so important to her. Andrew's teasing is funny because he normally has very little power. The family chaos works because Margaret desperately wants to remain composed. The humor therefore grows from character rather than replacing character. As the romance develops, the visual language becomes more relaxed. There is more room for proximity, more eye contact, more pauses. The direction allows attraction to emerge without constantly announcing it. That restraint is particularly valuable in a movie with such an exaggerated premise. If every emotional moment were played at maximum intensity, the film would become exhausting. Instead, the sincerity arrives gradually. The audience begins noticing that Margaret and Andrew are comfortable together before the characters fully understand it themselves. The ensemble reactions also keep the tone grounded. When the family responds to the fake engagement, the audience gets an external measurement of how absurd the situation is. That prevents the movie from taking its own premise too seriously. At the same time, Fletcher allows the emotional moments to remain sincere. This is the balancing act that protects the proposal. It knows the story is ridiculous, but it does not believe the characters are ridiculous. That distinction is essential. The premise can be unrealistic while the emotions remain recognizable. And that may be Fletcher's most effective directorial decision. She never asks the audience to believe that the circumstances are normal. She asks them to believe that the people are real. Once that happens, the movie can get away with almost anything. Part 7. Music sound. Section 7.1. Musical score analysis. The music in the proposal performs a subtle but important job. It tells the audience when the movie wants us to laugh and when it wants us to feel. That distinction matters because romantic comedy constantly moves between those emotional registers. A scene can begin as a joke and suddenly reveal something vulnerable. A character can be embarrassed one second and emotionally exposed the next. Music helps guide those transitions. In Margaret's professional world, the tone is often more controlled. The score supports movement and pace without demanding attention. The emphasis remains on dialogue, because Margaret's professional personality is built through words, authority, and rapid interaction. But as the story moves toward Alaska, the emotional atmosphere becomes warmer. The setting naturally creates room for music to breathe. The score can support the sense that Margaret is entering a different part of her life. This is especially useful because the audience needs to recognize emotional changes before the characters openly acknowledge them. A musical cue can soften a moment. It can suggest that a joke has emotional significance. It can encourage the audience to see a character with greater sympathy. That becomes particularly important for Margaret. The movie cannot suddenly announce that she is vulnerable. It has to gradually change the way we experience her. Music contributes to that process. The same character who initially feels intimidating can begin to feel lonely depending on how a scene is scored. The score also supports the chemistry between Margaret and Andrew. Romantic comedy music often operates through anticipation. It does not necessarily tell us that the characters are in love. It suggests that something is developing. That distinction allows the audience to experience the romance before the characters consciously accept it. As the story approaches its emotional climax, the musical language becomes more sincere. The comedy does not disappear, but the emotional stakes become more prominent. The music gives the ending a sense of arrival. This is where score and pacing work together. A romantic comedy cannot remain at maximum comedic speed for its entire runtime. Eventually, it needs to slow down. The audience needs space to process what has changed. Music creates that space. It allows silence and emotion to coexist with the established comedic tone. That is one reason certain musical moments can remain associated with a film long after specific plot details fade. We may not remember exactly what happened in a scene, but we remember how the movie made the scene feel. And that is one of the quiet powers of a romantic comedy score. It turns narrative information into emotional memory. Section 7.2. Song sound design. Sound design in the proposal is often less noticeable than the dialogue, and that is exactly why it works. The movie is fundamentally dialogue-driven. Margaret's personality is expressed through sharp commands. Andrew's personality emerges through sarcasm and reaction. The family's personality comes through interruptions, overlapping conversations, and spontaneous exchanges. The soundtrack supports that verbal energy without overwhelming it. Songs help reinforce the romantic comedy identity of the film. They can signal transitions between locations, establish mood, or create a sense of momentum. But the environmental sound becomes especially valuable in Alaska. The natural world sounds different from the corporate world. The office has phones, movement, conversations, doors, elevators, and the constant hum of professional activity. Those sounds reinforce Margaret's identity. Everything is busy. Everything is scheduled. Everything is connected to work. Alaska introduces different textures. The environment feels less controlled. That difference allows the audience to hear Margaret's transformation, as well as see it. Physical comedy also depends heavily on sound. A movement becomes funnier when the sound emphasizes its awkwardness. A pause becomes more uncomfortable when the soundtrack gets out of the way. Silence can therefore be just as important as music. During emotionally vulnerable moments, reducing the sonic clutter allows the audience to focus on a character's reaction. That is especially important for Margaret, because her vulnerability is often communicated through what she does not say. The soundscape creates room for those moments. Music also helps bridge the movie's different worlds. The story moves from Manhattan to Alaska, from office comedy to family comedy, from fake romance to genuine emotion. Audio continuity helps keep those shifts from feeling disconnected. And there is another reason the soundtrack contributes to the film's nostalgic quality. Songs can anchor movies to specific eras. When audiences return to a film years later, the music can immediately transport them back to the period in which they first watched it. That is particularly powerful for late 2000s romantic comedies. The sound does not simply accompany the movie. It becomes part of the memory of the movie, and the proposal understands that the strongest audio tool is still the human voice. The sarcasm, the awkward pause, the nervous confession, the family interruption, the sudden silence, the laugh that breaks tension. Those sounds make the film feel lived in. And when the movie eventually becomes sincere, the contrast makes that sincerity more powerful.